Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get started just because I know, yeah, some people can't stay the whole time and I kind of want to make sure we get that information out there. This meeting is gonna be recorded though, and I'll be sharing it with all of you so you guys can go ahead and share that. It'll be available on our YouTube, on our website. So yeah, hopefully you'll be able to share that with people who could benefit from this conversation. So I'm gonna share my screen just to talk about a little bit about the project. Let's see. Can y'all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes. No.
So thank you all for being here this evening. I know it's always hard at those evening meetings at 5. Everyone's typically used to getting off and enjoying their dinner with their family and whatnot. But thank you all for being here and taking time out of your day to learn about the vaccine and hopefully better help the community with everything that's going on with COVID-19. So a little bit about the project. This is part of Stop COVID-19 California, which is Share Trust Organized Partner, the California COVID-19 California Alliance. It's a National Institute of Health, NIH Community Engagement Alliance funded project. And it's made up of teams from UCLA, SDSU, UCR, Stanford, UCD, Scripps, UCI, UC Merced, UCSF, and USC. And in each of these different areas, there's research teams, and these research teams are focusing in on COVID-19 awareness and education research among African American, Hispanic, Latinx, and Indigenous communities. So goals from our community, from the Native community, is listen, learn, analyze, and make change. So listen. So the first thing we did is we held talking circles, focus groups, which some of you were at, and heavily based in community engagement. So a big thank you to Riverside-San Bernardino County Indian Health and Sherry for being on this project, because it's all thanks to you guys that we're able to do this work. And from those focus groups and talking circles, we learned what the community was facing on an individual level and a communal level. And then we analyzed that, what was shared, and we were thinking the whole time, like, what can we do to help? How can we better help this pandemic? So make change, putting words into actions. So one thing that was shared in the talking circles was the need for a town hall or a community meeting like this to kind of break down the vaccine and understand how it works, how the vaccines work. So then that way we can share it more with the community and are able to break it down for people who might not understand it and elders who might not know what they should take or how the vaccine works. How do they get appointments? So we brought in Dr. David Lowe from UCR, who's going to be talking a little bit about breaking down the vaccine for everyone. You know, scientifically, what is the vaccine? How does it work in your body, et cetera. And then we brought in Dr. Ramon Ferra from Riverside-San Bernardino County Indian Health to talk about a little bit about Indian services and health services and how the appointments work, how you can get an appointment, things of that nature. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lowe to get started on his presentation about addressing the vaccine.
Okay, thanks for inviting me to present this. This is just a sort of a recent update in terms of what the status of the vaccines are and what you can expect. So let's see here. I want it to let me advance the slides. Hold on a second, I'll get it.
Are you able to go into present mode?
That's what I'm gonna do. Okay, can you see the slide?
Yes.
Okay. I had a problem with, I had 2 screens and I was clicking on the wrong thing. Okay, so we have had the pandemic for over a year now. I can remember when the campus closed in March. And the incredible thing is that, we knew that we had the technology. It was just amazing to see that the companies were able to actually come up with viable vaccines in a short period of time. So that's all been very exciting. My background is that I've done a little bit of vaccine development as well, although I haven't been involved in this particular study, but it's been exciting to watch how the technologies that we're familiar with been applied to this in such a short period of time. So what I wanted to bring this update to you is about what's new about these vaccines and what's different about them, and what the impact is going to be as these vaccines become available. So this is really a general overview on what to expect in terms of how the vaccines work. So, you are probably all familiar with all the pneumovax and the shingles vaccines and things like that. And in basic principle, they're not really terribly different. But just to give you an overview of, how we got here is like, here's a basic, in the upper left here is a basic overview of how your own body cells work. And so on the left, you have the DNA, that's your genome, and they produce message molecules called RNA, which then go and they have the code that instructs the cells to produce the proteins. And the proteins are really the active machinery that makes things happen in your cells and so on. So for viruses that cause disease, they use a very similar kind of machinery. They start with DNA, they produce RNA, and then they produce the proteins. And those proteins are the things that are the active part of the virus. They promote replication. They can, bind to cells and help promote infection and so on. On the upper right is a picture of immunity. So when you get infected by an infectious disease, whether it's a bacteria or virus or something like that, your immune system actually then activates a few different components of your immune system. And the real business end of the immune system is antibody production. And that's those green Y-shaped molecules. So the immune system, after experiencing the infection, will produce these antibodies that are intended to bind to the proteins of the virus in this case, and they block the virus activity because they can prevent the virus from binding to cells and infecting other cells and things like that. So what vaccines are supposed to do is they try to mimic the process of infection without making you actually sick, but as a result, producing the immune system response, which is again the antibodies. And those antibodies are against the active component, the important component of the virus, which is the protein that is part of the whole biology of viral infection and so on. So what we want vaccines to do is to produce antibodies to bind to the virus proteins, inactivate them, and block the virus. So we now have 3 vaccines that have been approved and probably 2 more that are late-stage clinical trials that may also be approved soon. And they all really go through different steps, but again, they all operate on the basic same principle in terms of the business end of the immune system and the virus protein. So let me start on the right side. You can see the protein is on the right side. So Novavax is a company that's producing a vaccine that is basically just manufacturing that viral protein and using that as the vaccine. Take one step back, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines you may have heard of are using the RNA molecule that's synthesized, and they basically mimic the steps where the RNA is the instructions with the code that tells the cells to produce the proteins. So by injecting the RNA from the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, they instruct your own cells to make that virus protein and trigger an immune response against that protein. More recently, the approved J&J vaccine and the one that's in clinical trials now, and that's the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. This actually takes one step back even more, where the vaccine actually has its own genome that has the code for the virus protein that is the target of the immune response. And so in this case, in fact, what's kind of cool about that is that they basically engineer a new synthetic virus that is different from the coronavirus that causes the disease. It's an engineered virus that has its own genome that instructs the cells to produce the virus protein and triggers an immune response. And what's cool is that J&J vaccine only requires 1 shot, whereas the other ones require, so far, they require 2 shots. So the question, of course, everybody wants to know is, does it matter which vaccine you get? As I said, they all basically operate on the same principle. In the end, you have the protein that the immune response reacts to. produces the antibody, and basically is able to block the activity of the virus. So however you get there, whether it's the direct shot from the protein or whether you go use the mRNA message or the engineered virus, they all operate the same way. Similarly, for testing the vaccine, they also operate on the same principle. First step is to make sure the vaccines are safe. So they go through testing hundreds or thousands of people that look for side effects. And fortunately, if you've been vaccinated against anything else, it's basically very familiar. The main side effects are the same ones you get. There's soreness at the injection site. Sometimes you can get tiredness, headache, chills, fever, things like that, but they tend to be really short-lived. The next step in the studies have to do with effectiveness, right? So how well does the vaccine induce an immune response, and how well does that immune response protect you from disease? And the main measures may be slightly different from one company's trials to the next, but they basically ask the same question. Does it protect you from dying from the virus infection? Does it help prevent you from getting severe disease that requires hospitalization? And in some degree, those are the questions they ask of all of them. And, fortunately, all of the vaccines that have been approved so far have very similar high effectiveness. So in terms of the most important criteria, is it protecting you from death? Is it protecting you from severe disease and hospitalization? They're all pretty much in the 80-90% range in terms of protecting you from disease. And to give you perspective on this is that if you take the annual flu shot, not only is it of a concern because only half the people who should be taking the shot take it, but of the people who take the flu shot every year, it is only 50% effective. Now, it still has an impact. It still has a major impact because even covering 50%, it still makes a difference in the population. As I mentioned, the J&J vaccine only requires one shot. And, there have been discussions about whether or not these variants have some impact in terms of spreading through the population and so on. This morning, there was a press conference with Tony Fauci and the CDC director as well. And they've done studies now, and they've shown that all of these vaccines have similar effectiveness against all of the variants. And they actually trigger multiple parts of the immune system. So they're actually quite effective, even against the variants that have been coming up. So far, there hasn't been any cause to change our policy in terms of vaccination. So now the quick question is, once you've been vaccinated, what does that mean? So if you've been vaccinated, you are going to be, most of the people are going to develop these nice antibodies that will block the virus. And so what does that mean? If you have those antibodies circulating in your body, that means that if you can get exposed, and in some cases, you may still get a virus infection if somebody coughs in your face, those antibodies in your body are really going to protect you from in a couple of different important ways. It means that at best, you're going to get mild or minimal symptoms if you even get infected at all. And you will almost be completely protected from the need for hospitalization, and almost zero risk for severe disease and death. So that's really important. The other thing that's really cool, and something that's really gathered a lot more data that's been reported very recently this week, that the vaccine and the antibodies also make sure that even if you do get infected for some reason, and of course you're protected from symptoms and things like that, you are also going to prevent that infection from spreading it to anybody else. So that not only are you protected personally, but even if you get exposure, you are not going to be able to transmit it to anybody else. So from a community point of view, that's an outstanding outcome. So now what else has changed in terms of what can you do once you've been vaccinated? So now the guidelines from the CDC are that now once you get vaccinated, 2 weeks after your last shot, you can now be indoors in closed spaces with other fully vaccinated people, and you don't have to wear a mask. You can also gather with other unvaccinated people from other households without masks. And you do want to be careful, again, because there may be some people who are at high risk, people who have chronic diseases, cancer, and things like that. So you do want to be careful to not expose them as well. But the other important thing is that if you are exposed to somebody that you know has active disease, you no longer have to worry. You don't have to stay away. You don't have to quarantine after the encounter or anything like that. You should take a notice of whether or not you're developing symptoms or not. But what's also been interesting is that we know that because of all the precautions people have been taking, we basically had no flu season this year too. So things have been reasonably effective. In California, the rate of the new cases has still been going down. I know there's some concern because it's been going up in other states, like on the East Coast. The most recent numbers I was able to get was that the new cases per day, I mean, there are still new cases being seen in California, and it really does vary a lot from one part of the state to the next. The positivity rate from the testing is low, but it's still considered a high risk. Fortunately, because the vaccine has become more available and actually Pfizer and Moderna have actually been able to deliver more doses than had been originally expected. So that's good news. And so pretty much people in terms of phase 1, A through C, healthcare workers, people 65 and older, educators, first responders have all been qualified to get the vaccine. We're actually, the other good news is that because of the increased deliveries of the vaccines, we are expecting that maybe by mid to late April, almost anybody is qualified to get the vaccine. So that's good news as well. We are mainly getting the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. I think the J&J is still low availability, but that will be wonderful when that becomes available because, as I said, that only requires a single shot. In the meantime, practice safe behaviors, get the vaccine when you have it available. I know there's still some variability from region to region in terms of how quickly the vaccines are getting out there. People are starting to be able to find ways to deliver vaccines to people who can't get to some of these vaccination stations and things like that. So we're starting to be able to address a lot of these issues. If you want some amusement, we have a website where we have a series of short videos explaining how vaccines work and things like that. But in the meantime, hopefully this will be a useful update on where we are with the vaccinations, and I can, if there's time, I can take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lowe. Dr. Ferra, did you want to speak a little bit about Riverside-San Bernardino County Indian Health and what you're seeing, and a little bit about vaccines in that area specifically?
Certainly. So just a point of introduction, my name is Ray Ferra, and I did my medical school at UC Irvine. I did residency at USC, and I'm on the medical school advisory board at UC Riverside. So I've got you pretty much covered on your introductory slide, Wyatt. I'm the clinical services director for RSBCIHI, and we have full functioning primary care clinics in 8 locations across the 2 counties, and we offer primary care, a robust BHS department, eye care, dental care, and we have in-house specialties, including gynecology, podiatry, nephrology, telepsychiatry, both adult and child psychiatry, and teleendocrinology. At the beginning of the pandemic, we got into this endeavor, full force, and very quickly we immediately started testing. We started testing, I think, on the 17th or 18th of March of 2020. We've had a very robust program for testing. We have isolation rooms in all of our facilities. And at the height of the pandemic, we were at about 25, 26% positivity rate. We're considerably down now to about 3 or 4% positivity rate. We've lost some of our members, of course, and a lot of people have been sick. But overall, I think we've done a fantastic job of curtailing the pandemic in our population. Once the vaccines became available, we embraced that pretty swiftly. We received the first vaccines like on December the 18th, and by December the 22nd, we were starting to immunize patients. We've gone through all of the phases. So basically, we are at the point of doing 16 or 18 and over, depending on the vaccine. We have Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson vaccines at hand. We have been doing, this has evolved, of course, from the time that we started vaccination to current day. What's happening current day is on Fridays at 4 of our large clinics, we're doing mass vaccinations to a maximum of 300 doses per day per clinic. So 300 times 4, that's 1,200 vaccines on Fridays. The rest of the week, we divide up amongst the smaller clinics, and also starting this week, we developed a mobile vaccination unit, and we go to the casinos basically and immunize tribal employees, which include the casino employees. And as of today, we've added families of people that we vaccinate who live in the premises, including for those who are employees. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. We have the ability to run a clinic for Moderna, or run a clinic for Pfizer, or run a clinic for J&J, or do it simultaneously depending on the location and the interest. All 3 of these vaccines are what we call multi-dose vials, which means that when you open a vial, you've got to use the number of doses that you have within 6 hours. So for Moderna, it's 10 doses. So we do Modernas in groups of 10. For Pfizer, it's 6 doses. So we do it in groups of 6. And for J&J, it's 5 doses. So we'll do it in groups of 5. And I'll entertain any questions. And I do have a question for Dr. Lowe that's been coming up a lot in our, sorry, my computer's giving me a message that I don't need to listen to. That's been coming up more frequently is, as this evolves, Dr. Lowe, do you see this going into a flu-like protocol where we're going to do boosters every 6 or 12 months?
Well, that's a really good question, because that really relates to 2 things. One is whether or not the variants are varying sufficiently that you may need to change the way the vaccine is produced to protect against the variants. So far, it hasn't been clear that that's necessary. The other related question, though, is how long does protection last? Because we've only had the vaccines for a bit less than a year, so we don't know what the long-term protection looks like. And as the data is accumulated over the next year or so, we'll get a better picture on whether or not the vaccine protection needs a booster, say, every year or not. We just simply don't have those answers yet.
Gerald, you had a question? Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat or raise your hand, or we'll just go ahead and keep it going.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Lowe. I was wondering, and I appreciate the question about how long it lasts. That was one of my questions. But also following up on that is, one of the things I've heard is, are there any pre-existing conditions that tribal people may suffer from that might should prevent them from getting the vaccine?
Right now, the
Go ahead, Dr.
only concerns are that you should, there have been, I think, fewer than 5 cases where somebody had an allergic reaction. That is infinitesimally small compared to, you know, the millions of doses that have been given so far, hundreds of millions actually by now. So I'm not aware of any indication to not. So I would put that in the context, for example, if you have an egg allergy, there are people who shouldn't take some of the flu vaccines because of the egg allergy. But because these vaccines are entirely synthetic, there's no concern that if you have a pre-existing egg allergy or something like that, you have to worry about it. So far, there are no indications that suggest that you should not have the vaccination. Now, people who may be immunosuppressed, like say if you have cancer and you're undergoing chemotherapy, your ability to respond to the vaccine may be lower, but since there's no infectious virus or anything like that in the vaccine, you have no worries that you're going to have an infection because you're immunosuppressed. That's the sort of thing you'd have to worry about, say, for example, if you got the live polio vaccine or something like that, where a live weakened virus would be a concern. In this case, you have no live virus, no live infectious agent. So even if you're immunosuppressed, there should be no concern about taking the vaccine.
Great, thank
So
you.
the concerns from our side, are severe allergic reactions, and every patient who's getting a vaccine gets a questionnaire regarding this. We have a provider at every location to delve further into these questions. So we go and interview the patient and get details on what kind of severe reactions they've had in the past. After 4,000 or so vaccines so far for us, we've seen very, very few reactions, none really severe enough to send to the hospital, and a couple that received an EpiPen treatment and they went home. I will say that there is one caveat, since a lot of people have had COVID, and some patients who had COVID were treated with monoclonal antibody or a convalescent plasma. Those patients have to wait 90 days from the treatment before they can receive the vaccine. And we've had a couple of people come through with that history.
I saw one of the comments asking about fertility issues from the vaccine. I've actually had that question many times. I don't know. I don't. There must be some rumors going around about concerns about that, but I can tell you that there are certainly far worse consequences for not being vaccinated if you're pregnant. That's one, certainly. There's low birth weights and things like that. There are clinical trials going on right now in pregnant mothers. And so far, there have been no signs of any adverse reactions or anything like that. But there is absolutely no evidence that the vaccination has any impact on future fertility.
So one thing I left out in my introduction is that I'm a gynecologist obstetrician by training. So I spent 35 years delivering babies before I became a virologist and an epidemiologist and an emergency responder over the last year. But to my knowledge, there is no known vaccine that causes any kind of infertility. And with respect to pregnant women, even though we don't have 100% of the data in, we're fairly confident that it does not affect the pregnancy in any way. It does not affect the unborn fetus in any way. And if you are pregnant and get COVID, you have a much chance of having a severe disease, which will affect the pregnancy in terms of, as Dr. Lowe said, premature delivery and low birth weights and respiratory issues with premature babies.
Also, the vaccine does transfer antibodies to your baby if you're pregnant. So that's good news
Passive
too.
immunity, yes.
Does anybody have any other questions for Dr. Ferra or Dr. Lowe and relating to the vaccine, or anything that's on your mind that you've been hearing or curious about that you think the community should address? Gerald?
Yeah. So another question. It seems like I know these vaccines were developed very quickly on the fly, and there's all these different tests being done on those now, and it seems like initially it was 18 and above, and recently I saw 16 and above. And so where are we at? Like, whose kids do we need to start thinking about getting vaccinated? And at what age?
Actually, the results were just reported on testing the vaccines in children, and it ended up with basically protecting 100% of the kids. So that was pretty impressive results there. The age thing is really part of the way the FDA approaches things, because safety is always the #1 issue. And so the concern is to make sure that when they do the clinical trials, they test in adults, because there are a lot of experimental and just medical reasons why you want to focus on adults, and then there are a separate set of rules for doing studies in children. And so that's why you see some of these different age brackets and things like that. They're mainly because of guidelines that the FDA has for clinical studies. And as I said, now that, so for example, many of the vaccines, they test in regular, adults in a certain age range, and then they may do separate tests on adults over 65 and separate tests on kids under 18. Again, it's mainly because of safety issues, but also because the effectiveness of the vaccines may be different in different age groups. And that's been true for things like flu vaccines and so on.
So currently, I agree with what Dr. Lowe just said. And so currently the FDA has approved each vaccine for the parameters that they tested. So for Pfizer, it's 16 and above, and for Moderna and J&J, it's 18 and above. But I did want to address the concern about how quickly these were developed. And I'm sure that Dr. Lowe could speak more eloquently about this, but as I understand it, the research on messenger RNA has been very robust over the last few years. So when this pandemic came about, and the concepts of cell biology have been now very well understood since the 70s, they were able to really fast track this to develop the vaccines much quicker in our era than they could have been, say, when the original flu vaccines were developed or the polio vaccines were developed. In that era, it took years to develop. Now we have the fundamental knowledge and data in a bank that we can use and develop things much quicker.
Yeah, I want to amplify what Dr. Ferra is saying, because we knew about mRNAs and things like that for decades. What made this happen so much quicker is that they could discover the virus and get the full sequence that codes for the proteins within a matter of weeks. In the much more distant history, it took years to be able to isolate the infectious disease, let alone have it sequenced and figure out what to do. So once you had that within the first few weeks, you already knew how to produce the vaccine. And then the next critical issue was just simply the formulation and manufacture. And so a lot of the new advances in chemistry and things like that, basically, how do you synthesize big vats of RNA? And they basically do a lot of this with synthetic enzymes that help speed up that process. So a lot of the speed is not so much, understanding the basics of how the vaccine works and what has to be produced. It was largely an engineering achievement in terms of finding the virus and getting it sequenced, and finding ways to manufacture large quantities and getting it into clinical trials within such a quick turnaround.
Do we have any other questions?
I see Samantha's hand is up. But you're muted, Samantha. There you are.
There we go. I have my little dog running around. I hope people be quiet while I ask this. I'm curious about the variants of the viruses and how they differ, and just trying to understand that. I don't know what variant is most predominant in the Riverside County area or Southern California right now. I just wondered if anybody had any information on that.
Well, what I can say, actually, one of our faculty has been working on the structure of these proteins, and with the variants. So viruses, as they infect people, they always undergo a certain amount of mutation, and that's why we need a different flu shot every year. So there's always mutations, and there are mutations in lots of different parts of the virus. Many of them don't help the virus at all. They actually hurt. But what variants can expand are the ones that affect how easily it infects one individual and how it's easily spread to the next person. So this virus appears to have been originated in bats. And there was a period of time before it figured out how to infect humans, because probably for most of its evolution, it was not able to infect humans. And so the variants arose because the various mutations that occur found, variants that could be better at infecting humans and better at being transmitted from one to another. And so around the world, individuals who are infected are sort of like little incubators for variants and, evolution of the virus. And so all around the world, there are different viruses that rise because the mutations that randomly occur just seem to help that virus infect other people. There's been a little bit of evidence that the variants in some places, I think like in England, there's thought that the variant may make people a little bit sicker. Right now, it seems that the variants, mainly like the one in California, there's one in New York, there's a couple in Europe, that the main advantage they've had is that they just are better at infecting humans and spreading from one to the next. They don't appear to make people that much sicker, if at all sicker, but I mean, obviously it's a bad enough disease, you don't want it anyway. But that's the thing. That's why I mentioned that this morning at the press conference, Tony Fauci was saying that when they've tested the immune response of people that have been vaccinated and tested their response against the variants, they have found that immunized people are responding as well to the variants as they are to the original vaccine strain. So that's good news, that the variants are not yet so different that they need a new different vaccine, unlike the situation we have with flu every year.
Anyone else have any other questions? This has been great. Thank you so much, Dr. Lowe and Dr. Ferra. This is amazing information to share.
Happy to be a part of it, and for any future events, be happy to participate.
And so Wyatt, you're going to make the slides available?
Yeah, I'll make this. I'm going to be sending out a follow-up email with the slides and the video and the audio, so then people can share it with their communities, share it with their networks, and hopefully get this information out, because I feel like it's very valuable to know, especially the things about the variants, because I get a lot of questions about that as well from my own parents. But what should I do? Should I get this vaccine, this and that? Where do I get a vaccine? How do I go about it? So it's been really great having you guys here. So I just wanted to take a moment to talk about kind of what's next moving forward in this project. So we had this town hall, and now what we're going to do after this is we plan to host kind of like healing circles and bring in some healers from the communities to kind of just talk about all the loss that's happened through COVID-19. So be on the lookout for that. I'll be emailing everyone about that in the coming weeks. I know Sherry's going to be up in that, and Juliet as well. So thank you guys so much. And if no one has any questions, we can end a little bit early tonight and let people get on with their evenings.
I just would like to encourage everyone to get a vaccine. Don't worry so much about which one. Get a vaccine. get everybody around you immunized.
Thank you. Any closing thoughts, anyone?
I do. I just want to say thank you to Dr. Lowe and Dr. Ferra for coming and talking to us. And I really enjoyed the slides that he showed. So that was really helpful. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank you, Sherry.
Well, thanks for the great questions.
Great. Thank you, guys. Be in touch tomorrow with the video, the slides, and more information.
Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks. Thank you.